This was a long time ago, and there was a man who lived in town named Paul. And Paul's one of these fellas that loved stories. And he wasn't superstitious, but whenever he heard a new story, he'd go out and seek out that story, see if it's true or not. Now, Paul came across this story that there was a grave in one of those cemeteries around town. He didn't know which one, but there was a grave that on one particular night of the year, that grave was known to bleed. And I bet you know what night that was. All Hallows Eve. So Paul waited for that night to come around, and he went out to see if he could find the grave that was supposed to bleed. And he went to cemetery after cemetery. None of them had a bleeding grave. And finally he came to the very last one. It was a cemetery where a lot of soldiers are buried. My town was not too far from where the Battle of Antietam took place. And it's an old cemetery, not too wide, but pretty deep. And so old that the beds in front of a lot of the headstones had started to sink down just a little bit, so you got to watch your step. They're real mossy and they give a little. And he made his way deep, deep into that cemetery till he got to the furthest reach. And in the darkness of the night, he could have sworn he saw there was a headstone that he thought was bleeding. Well, there's some kind of liquid coming down the very topmost part of it, down the face and into those engraved letters. And since it was dark, he couldn't tell what color it was. He got close and took a couple of fingers and wiped right into that liquid. Rubbed on his fingertips, it felt like blood. Smelled like blood. That was as far as he went. He was convinced. Well, he went back home and didn't think anything more of it until he got into bed. And just after he got into bed, thought he heard a sound coming from downstairs. Knocking on the door. He didn't think anything of it at first because it was, after all, Halloween. There were kids out playing tricks. That knocking continued. So he rolled out of bed and came downstairs and followed the sound to his front door. And when he opened the door, there's nothing there but that late October wind. He stepped out onto the porch and looked around and called out into that wind, "You kids leave me alone." He said, "Don't play no tricks here." He said, "I'll call the authorities on you." And he turned around to go back inside, but the door had shut. And as he reached for the knob, he heard the door lock. And now it was Paul that was knocking on that door. "Let me in," he said. "This is my house. Stop playing tricks like this. Open up this door right now." And he heard that deadbolt slide and click, and the door just opened all on its own. He stepped into his front room and looked around, and there was no one in there, but there was just a little bit of that wind. But he wasn't superstitious, so he just closed the door and went upstairs back to bed. But no sooner had he gotten into bed than he heard that knocking again. He came back down the stairs, went to the front door, but it wasn't coming from the front door this time. It was coming from somewhere in his house. He followed that sound to the door that led to the basement. And that knocking was coming from the other side.